"Rachel," Mark began, his voice measured, "I need you to arrange a meeting with the head of HR and the flight supervisor at our New York office. There's something I need to address." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "Of course, Mr. Dalton. Should I prepare any specific details for the meetings?" Mark paused, his tone deliberate. "Yes. I'll need a full review of the service records for an employee named Cindy Cameron. Let's make sure everything is ready for a thorough discussion on customer treatment and professionalism." Rachel's calm acknowledgement was reassuring. She had seen Mark handle countless challenges over the years and knew how seriously he took the culture of Dalton Airlines. The following morning, as Mark arrived at the Dalton Airlines New York headquarters, Rachel greeted him with a neat stack of reports. Her expression was composed, but the weight of the situation was clear. "These are Cindy Cameron's service records," she said, handing them to him. Mark flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening as he read. The reports were worse than he'd anticipated. Cindy's file was riddled with customer complaints, each one echoing the same frustrations he had witnessed firsthand. Her attitude, her dismissive treatment of passengers, her lack of empathy, it all painted a troubling picture. Mark set the papers down, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about one flight or one incident. Cindy's behavior was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that, if left unchecked, could erode the values he had fought so hard to instill in his airline. He took a deep breath, his mind already formulating the next steps. Cindy Cameron had no idea what was coming. Cindy's service record painted a troubling picture, multiple warnings, even a few disciplinary notes, yet she had somehow managed to keep her position. It was 10 a.m. when Mark met with Tom Reeves, the HR manager, and Lydia Coleman, the head of customer service, in the conference room. Both were seasoned professionals who took employee issues seriously. After brief introductions, Mark recounted the events of his flight in detail. He described Cindy's behavior, not just toward him but also toward other passengers. His tone was measured but firm, making it clear this wasn't just about a personal slight. This was about the integrity of the airline. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mr. Dalton," Tom said, his expression serious. "It's disappointing to hear this behavior has persisted despite prior warnings." Lydia nodded. "We pride ourselves on delivering exceptional service. Addressing this is not just important, it's essential." Mark shook his head, raising a hand to stop them. "This isn't something that can be handled with just a discussion. I'd like to be present when you speak with her. This is about more than just one employee. It's about preserving the values we stand for." Though slightly surprised, both Tom and Lydia agreed. They respected Mark's decision to be directly involved, understanding how much he cared about the company's standards. Later that afternoon, Cindy was called into the office, unaware of the true purpose of the meeting. As she stepped inside, she looked around nervously, her gaze falling on the unfamiliar faces. But when her eyes landed on Mark, recognition flashed across her face. She froze, the color draining from her cheeks. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The ordinary-looking passenger from yesterday's flight was the owner of Dalton Airlines. Mark met her gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Cindy sat down, visibly shaken. She opened her mouth to speak, stumbling over her words. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry if I..." Mark raised a hand, silencing her gently but firmly. "Cindy, let's set aside titles for a moment. This isn't about who I am. I don't expect special treatment, no one should. But I do expect respect, decency, and courtesy from every passenger on my airline. It's not about appearances or assumptions. It's about treating people with dignity, no matter what." Cindy looked down, her face a mix of shame and fear. Lydia spoke next, her tone firm but professional. "We've reviewed your service record. This isn't an isolated incident. You've been given multiple chances to improve, but the pattern hasn't changed." Mark leaned forward, his voice softer but steady. "Cindy, we value every employee, and we do our best to provide growth opportunities. But we can't allow poor treatment to go unchecked. This isn't personal. It's about upholding the promise we make to our passengers and staying true to the values that define Dalton Airlines." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of his words. Cindy sat motionless, the reality sinking in. She knew what was coming. After a moment, Mark continued, his tone resolute. "I believe in second chances, Cindy, but in your case, there have been many. The disrespect you showed yesterday wasn't just directed at me. It was a breach of the values we stand for. Unfortunately, I don't believe you can continue with us at Dalton Airlines." Cindy's eyes widened, but she didn't protest. Deep down, she knew this moment had been inevitable. Lydia handed her a folder containing her termination documents. "We'll provide a severance package to help with your transition," she said gently. "But today will be your last day with us." Cindy accepted the papers with trembling hands. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "Thank you, Mr. Dalton." I'm sorry." Mark nodded, his expression composed but firm. "I hope this experience serves as a lesson, Cindy. Respect and kindness cost nothing. I wish you well." With that, Cindy rose from her seat, casting one last uncertain glance around the room before quietly leaving. As the door clicked shut, a heavy silence lingered in the room. Mark exhaled deeply, the tension lifting from his shoulders. He turned to Tom and Lydia, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you for handling this with me. It's never easy, but I know it was the right call for our team and our passengers." Both Tom and Lydia nodded, sharing his sense of resolve. This decision wasn't just about enforcing policy. It was about reaffirming the core values that made Dalton Airlines a company of integrity and respect. As Mark left the building, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He hadn't just taken a stand for himself. He had stood up for every passenger who deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter who they were. And that, he thought to himself, was worth every step of this difficult journey. It was a serene Monday morning, the kind where the world feels just a little quieter. Mark Dalton, a man in his mid-40s, stepped aboard Sky Express 707. He moved with the unassuming air of someone who had taken countless flights before, because he had. After all, he owned the airline. Yet, few people would ever guess. Mark had built Dalton Airlines from the ground up, but he preferred to remain invisible, blending seamlessly with the travelers who unknowingly entrusted him with their journeys. To him, anonymity was a gift, a way to experience life as it truly was, unfiltered by wealth or status. Today, Mark wasn't the CEO. He was just another passenger in first class, quietly observing the world around him. Settling into his seat, he adjusted his tie and glanced out the window, the clouds rolling lazily across the horizon. It was supposed to be an uneventful flight to New York. But the universe, as it often does, had other plans. As passengers shuffled into their seats, his attention was drawn to a young woman a few rows ahead. She seemed on edge, her hands nervously fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Her eyes darted around the cabin, scanning her surroundings as if looking for reassurance. Mark had seen that look before. It was the look of someone battling their fear of flying. He couldn't help but smile faintly, recalling his own nervous beginnings in the aviation world. Back then, he, too, had felt the weight of uncertainty every time the wheels left the ground. Meanwhile, a tall, sharp-featured flight attendant made her way briskly down the aisle. Her name tag read Cindy Cameron, and her posture was as rigid as her expression. Cindy had been with Dalton Airlines for 3 years, but her demeanor suggested she thought herself above the role she played. Mark noticed how her eyes lingered on certain passengers, those without designer luggage or flashy watches. Her thin-lipped glances carried a silent verdict: "You don't belong here." Mark had seen people like Cindy before, quick to judge, slow to empathize. But he said nothing as she approached, her expression neutral, her tone clipped. "Here's the menu," she muttered, handing it to him without so much as meeting his eyes. The next passenger, a man sporting an expensive watch, was met with a dazzling smile and a cheerful nod. Mark said nothing, but he noticed everything. A little later, as the plane reached cruising altitude, Cindy returned with a tray of steaming coffee and beverages. She moved through the aisle with an air of impatience, her gestures mechanical, her smile long gone. When she reached Mark's row, he requested a simple cup of coffee. "What would you like?" she asked, barely glancing at him. "Just coffee, please," Mark replied politely. She sighed, rolling her eyes ever so slightly. The smallest gesture, but loud enough for Mark to hear her disdain. As she poured the coffee, her movements were hurried, almost careless. And then, in one swift moment, it happened. The cup tilted too far forward, and scalding coffee spilled onto Mark's face. He flinched, the burning liquid searing his skin. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Cindy said, her voice quick but devoid of sincerity. Her eyes betrayed no concern, no remorse, just a flicker of amusement, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Clumsy me. I must have tripped on something." Mark dabbed at his face with a napkin, his composure remarkably intact despite the sting. Across the aisle, a woman who had witnessed the entire ordeal leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. She handed him a tissue, her voice low but indignant. "That was completely uncalled for," she whispered, shaking her head. "I've never seen behavior like that from a flight attendant." Mark offered her a quiet nod of thanks, but he didn't respond. Instead, he sat back in his seat, deep in thought. Cindy's behavior was unacceptable. There was no doubt about that. But he wasn't the type to act on impulse. No, he preferred to wait, to watch, to understand the full picture before making his move. For the remainder of the flight, Cindy continued to ignore him. She passed by his seat without a second glance, offering no further assistance, no apology. If anything, she seemed pleased with herself, as though she had delivered some kind of justice to a man she deemed unworthy of first class. But what Cindy didn't realize was that the man she had dismissed so easily wasn't just another passenger. He was the one person she should have treated with the utmost respect. And as Mark quietly observed her, he knew this flight would be one she wouldn't soon forget. Because sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones with the power to change everything. The murmurs began softly, spreading like ripples through still water. Passengers who had witnessed Cindy's behavior exchanged incredulous glances and hushed whispers. Mark could hear snippets of their shock, remarks about her lack of professionalism, her dismissive attitude. But he kept his silence, as he always did, choosing observation over confrontation. It wasn't in his nature to cause a scene. He believed people revealed themselves over time, given the space to act without interference. As the flight continued its smooth journey to New York, Cindy's disdain only seemed to deepen. Mark watched as she showered other first-class passengers with warm smiles and attentive service, while deliberately bypassing him. Her glances at him were curt, her tone dismissive when she spoke to others nearby. It wasn't just him she targeted, though. Mark noticed her cold treatment of other passengers who didn't fit her narrow idea of what first class should look like. Mark remained composed, even as he felt the sting of her judgment. He had built Dalton Airlines to embody dignity and respect for every passenger, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. But Cindy's actions threatened that very ethos, and Mark couldn't ignore it. Still, he held back. For now. As the plane began its descent, Cindy's voice echoed through the cabin in a standard announcement for landing preparations. Her tone, however, lacked the warmth expected of a flight attendant. It was clipped and mechanical. Mark straightened in his seat, collecting his thoughts. He hadn't planned to make waves today, but after witnessing Cindy's repeated behavior, he knew he couldn't let this slide. What he'd observed wasn't just unprofessional. It was a betrayal of everything his airline stood for. Once the plane landed, Mark waited patiently, allowing other passengers to disembark before him. He watched as Cindy stood at the exit, her tone suddenly sweet and her smile bright, reserved only for those she deemed worthy of her attention. When Mark finally reached the door, her demeanor shifted instantly. Her smile faded, replaced by a curt nod. "Goodbye," she said flatly, looking past him to the next passenger. Mark's lips curved into a small, calm smile. "Goodbye, Cindy," he said warmly, his voice steady but pointed. "You may be hearing from me sooner than you think." Cindy blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. But she shrugged it off as quickly as it came. She had no idea who he was, nor did she care to find out. Mark pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number as he stepped into the terminal. His assistant, Rachel, picked up almost immediately. Rachel was his right hand, sharp, dependable, and unflinchingly professional.